Welcome to our dialogue special coming to you from the Xiangshan Forum in Beijing. I'm Yang Rui with the CGTN. Yes, indeed, we are in a world of unprecedented changes, opportunities, and multiple challenges as well as risks. And one of the biggest challenges, I'm afraid, is whether the strategic misguiding will lead us to a point of no return.
It is the best of times and the worst of times. Elite politics yield to populism. Unilateralism undermines multilateralism. Proxy wars threaten regional peace. And the world's political, economic, and military order is undergoing vast restructuring. Regional powers vie on the Korean Peninsula and in the Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. withdrawal from multilateral frameworks and President Donald Trump's global trade war has brought turbulence in emerging markets as well as the developed world. 2 decades after the end of the Cold War, are we witnessing a new kind of Cold War? To help understand the dynamics of this changing world order, we're delighted to be joined by Colonel Liu Lin, Associate Research Fellow at the Institute of Foreign Military Studies of the War Studies College at the Academy of Military Science, Wang Dong, Deputy Executive Director of the Institute for China-US People-to-People Exchange at Peking University. We'll also talk with Dr. Laura Salmon, Vice President of Asia-Pacific at the East-West Institute, Rajiv Ranjan Chaturvedi, Visiting Fellow from the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University, and Filippo Fasulo, Research Fellow at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. This is the Dialogue TV debate coming to you from the Xiangshan Forum.
First question is, of course, the latest move by President Donald Trump to pull out of the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty with Russia. How do you expect the European Union to react to this, which they said would threaten the security of continental Europe? First of all, Dr. Laura.
Well, I think that obviously this discussion over the INF Treaty, first of all, it's not new. It's been going on for quite a bit of time. And in fact, according to the U.S. contention, Russia has been an alleged violation of the treaty since 2014. So this is certainly predates the Trump administration. However, this strong stance, I think, does pose a challenge to the arms control agenda. I think it also poses a challenge not just to Russia and the United States relationship in the short term, but also to China's relationship with these countries in the longer term. Because obviously behind all of this is the fact that China has been developing its own intermediate range missiles and is not constrained by that treaty.
Colonel Liu Lin, you are still doing your homework, but it's too late. Now, your response to this move, a major move by President Trump, does it mean that our neighboring countries such as South Korea and Japan would also share the same concern, since the intermediate nuclear forces could be part of the U.S. threat to our national security? In fact, this is not just about the Europeans and the U.S., it's also about the Indo-Pacific region and its security. Do you agree?
Just as Laura has said, it is not have impact on U.S.-Russia relations. It will also have other implications, because we know the INF prevents the deployment, the development of the ground-based missiles with the range between 500 kilometers to 5,000 kilometers. I think the Trump administration withdrawal from the INF is because that they are worried that with the development of the missile technology, the short and the medium range missiles is quite important for the strikes. So they want to lift the prohibition of these missiles, the development of these missiles. But with the withdrawal from the INF, it means that the United States can deploy the short-range and the medium-range missiles in Guam, in Japan, in South Korea. So I think it will impact the security of China.
All the security in Northeast Asia. Philippa, you're from continental Europe. Do you believe the withdrawal from INF actually put the European Union and the Russians closer for more negotiations about an issue of collective security, which is far away from the other side of the Atlantic Ocean?
Yeah, it might be. Actually, I think the most relevant point is that this election Europe should learn quickly. That is, we cannot rely on the US as we rely in the past. And so we should try to find our own view and our own security policies. This is something that didn't happen in the last few years because the US was always there. And now we have to deal with a new, different threat. Russia has a very active foreign policy, and this affects all the economy, so we have to find a solution with them.
Subject matter of this debate, I'm afraid, Dr. Wang, is whether the new Cold War is around the corner. We have had many signs indicating the upcoming geopolitical rivalries between the two biggest economies, such as the latest encounter of the warships between the Chinese Navy and the American Pacific Fleet. And 2 American warships pass through the Taiwan Strait to deliver a clear message to the PLA armed forces. We are here to patrol and to protect the freedom of navigation one way or another. Now, other than this, President Trump decides to cancel. It's part of his withdrawal from so many multilateral commitments to withdraw from IMF. So what do you think of the impact and what it means for what we discuss here, new Cold War?
So I think you're right. You're absolutely right. This withdrawal from IMF simply just one of a series of moves that the Trump administration has been taking recently. I think it is actually has a lot. I agree with our panelists here. It has a lot of very important strategic implications because I think it is supposed to challenge or alter the global strategic equilibrium we are now have. And potentially, as Colonel Liu also noted that, you can see very clearly the Trump administration actually as some of the hawks within the administration and also in the ultra-conservative camps, they are advocating or very actively, proactively preparing for or paving the ground for or like ultimate showdown between the two great powers, China and the United States. So this move is actually is also aiming at 5-10 years from now. So I think this is, of course, one of the signs that we definitely should be concerned about, if not worried about.
I'd like to ask my Indian friend a question as to the definition of a new Cold War. Without a clear definition about this key concept, I'm afraid we could go into multiple directions without having a clear focus. I'd like to have your thoughts.
I think framing this whole development into the framework of Cold War won't be justifiable. We need to think beyond Cold War things, where there are elements where countries are cooperating with each other. Despite trade war between US and China, the volume of trade is going up. So that's not something which can be formulated into the Cold War framework. So we need to think beyond that, and I think new Cold War terminology is not apt to describe the whole development.
But the counter-argument says clearly, Dr. Laura, with so many senior politicians rising on the platform of populism, what happened prior to the First World War could be repeated in the present-day world, despite the close economic interdependence. Now, what our Indian friend Rajiv suggested quietly is the free movement of labor forces and the flow of technologies, capitals across the traditional borders of nation-state could help prevent the outbreak of hostilities. Do you agree?
Well, I think what you're describing is essentially two phenomena. So at one level, we've been discussing the Cold War, reemergence of the new Cold War. And at another level, you're talking about the preconditions for World War II. And obviously, there are differences. But I think what most people are concerned about is actually a hot war, not the Cold War. I still think that in this multilateral context that we're in right now, these comparisons aren't always apt. And it's simply because I think that the geopolitical tensions that we see right now, these levels at which cooperation and intermingling of interdependence, certainly at one level does bring frictions as much as it brings cooperation. But I think that if we really want a framework that will take us into the future and better understanding this, I think we really need to move back to the point of talking not only at the track 1 level, but also at track 1.5 and track 2.
Probably it's not a new Cold War around the corner, but we are reacting to domestic politics in the United States. For example, whenever there is a domestic or homegrown crisis that makes headlines back in the United States. President Trump would single out China for bashing, saying China, accusing China of meddling with their elections and domestic politics. This is ridiculous in the perspective of many Chinese observers. Do you think we are barking at the wrong tree? In fact, we are part of your domestic politics. We've been held hostage by this process before the midterm elections.
Well, as you pointed out just prior to this, in terms of populism, it isn't just a phenomenon that's going on in the United States. Obviously, there are domestic politics and popular opinion and nationalism cropping up in any number of countries. We see it, of course, not just in the U.S., we see it in China, we see it in Russia, we see it in India, and it's also accompanied by strong leadership in all of these various countries. That phenomenon in and of itself, I think, means that when we're looking at the U.S. context and how this may be used for domestic election purposes or otherwise, we also have to understand that there is an action and response that's coming from the other side. I think in the United States case, there's no question that China plays a big role. However, I wouldn't limit it to China. If you look at all of the major policy documents like the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, the Nuclear Posture Review that have come out of the United States, they focus on China, they focus on Russia, but I would say that the language that's used vis-a-vis Russia is much harsher than what you see vis-a-vis China. There's still some flexibility there. There's still a desire to sit down at the table and discuss and negotiate.
It's largely because the United States wants Russia to be down and out, but China just to be weaker, far weaker, maybe 2 decades way below or trailing behind the United States. That's different from the Cold War version.
I want to respond on your point. I agree that U.S. has a history of interfering in elections and domestic affairs of other countries. So blaming China that China is interfering in American elections, it's China, or for that matter other countries, are learning from what Americans were doing. So it's just you are getting back what you did. Second point about populism, I think the more issue in Asia is issue of governance, and that's why the countries like Indonesia, India, China, the people are expecting good governance, and that's why there is greater support and optimism for strong leaders who could bring results on ground, and there is upliftment of more humankind. So that's what West also needs to acknowledge and notice, that there is a change and revolution in this part of the world, and they need to adjust their selling and all to come with terms and to sit together, not to treat them differently but as equals. So rather than talking at each other, they need to talk to each other.
Right, instead of talking past each other, they should talk to each other. Now, any other points to be added to the definition of the Cold War or new Cold War?
I would add, if I can, that I have to focus on the positive side of Cold War, because there is a confrontation. Everybody agrees on the fact there is a confrontation, but everybody hopes and thinks that might be the war could stay cold. And I think this is a positive side of a possible confrontation, because we don't know what could happen. I would add also something about the populism, because you can see something related. Populism is not coming from nothing. It's not coming from any...
Look at the results of the Italian elections.
Exactly. In Italy, we are very, very well aware of any kind of populism, both now and in the past. And populism comes because people's expectations are not the same as economic reality gives them. What happens in the last 20 years is that there was economic shift from the middle level people in the West to Asia and other countries who become richer, and this is very good for the global community. But for those single people, was not that good. So what we have to do? We have to do, and we have to deal with China, for example, and other countries, to find a way that Chinese investment abroad and Chinese investment in Europe and the West might help and might have a very strong impact on local communities, so China can be perceived as a mutual benefit and a much better helper for global community and local economic conditions.
Just to add on his comments, I think the increasing tension between US and China, in a way it's also putting pressure in the region to develop and work urgently on code of conduct so that there won't be any military hostility in the South China Sea or East China Sea. So China and the countries in the region need to really work very hard so that as soon as possible, the code of conduct can be developed so that everyone follows the rules. And that's for everyone, including for China and America as well. That will be in the interest of the whole region.
Dr. Wang Dong, the latest flashpoint across the Taiwan Strait, I'm afraid, is the passing of 2 American warships through Taiwan Strait. That took place 1 year after the approval of the Taiwan Travel Act. And that means an apparent increase in the mill-to-mill exchanges between Taipei and Washington. Do you think this is likely to happen and trigger an increase of tensions between the 2 militaries?
So if we look at the history of cross-strait relations, I think the United States, of course, no doubt has been played a very important role in that. And also, strategically speaking, the United States has a track record of using Taiwan as a leverage, try to sort of hedge toward against the Chinese mainland in many ways. And then now, as the strategic tensions between Beijing and Washington now are on the rise, so naturally we see the United States taking, sort of again playing this game, so using Taiwan as a leverage, try to put more pressure on the Chinese mainland. So I think I think you're right. I think this is something is going to perhaps it's not just one incident, more will be coming in the coming, and I think it is also very important, I think, for policymakers in Washington, United States particularly, to understand that there's a danger of overplaying this card because it would definitely send a wrong signal to officials in Taipei, and we now see very clearly they got emboldened, and particularly if the pro-independent forces in Taiwan got emboldened and feel that they now have sort of a free pass or sort of United States on their back, and they have this freedom to pursue their independent agenda. It's bound to create a sort of lead Beijing, Chinese mainland and the United States into a confrontation that they actually do not want to get into in the first place. So I think this is a very important thing that I think for leaders, officials in Washington to be very cautious about.
Ironically, Dr. Laura, despite the declaration and claims of Washington over and over that it recognizes that there is only one China and that's shared by people across the Taiwan Strait, but why ambassadors from some small countries in Central America were recalled by Washington as an apparent sign of supporting Taipei after these governments in Central America decided to normalize relationship with Beijing? What do you think of the conflicting signals that Washington delivered to the rest of the world?
As I answer that question, I also wanted to touch upon a point that was just made, which I think is really crucial when we're talking about these freedom of navigation operations or anything, not just simply through the Taiwan Strait, South China Sea, East China Sea, and elsewhere. What's key in this is I think we need to pay more attention to the issue of unintended collisions that may occur in the future. We've seen this with the EP-3 reconnaissance plane incident, which happened nearly 2 decades ago, and yet now we're coming back to a time period where you not only have these operations being conducted by all sides, really, to enforce their own claims, but then at the same time as well, such a collision, if you don't have the measures in place in terms of conflict resolution and also notification, in advance, you are going to find that as we introduce unmanned systems into the region, unmanned underwater and also aerial vehicles, and then also we're looking at the United States. We've been talking with the Nuclear Posture Review about bringing out these tactical nuclear weapons that are mounted on submarine-launched cruise missiles and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. Having all of these factors and elements in the region in a crisis scenario where you have an unintended collision, I think is major, and I think we need to highlight that. On the Taiwan issue, I think this is obviously an issue that we've been looking at for many decades. One of the things that's interesting about it is all the years that I've been working on China, and I've been working on it since 1990. One of the big takeaways from this is track 2 level and track 1.5 level discussions and strategic dialogues is Taiwan, for many years, it actually it had, I would say, reduced the amount in which it was brought up at these talks. Now, of course, we see it reemerging. And, of course, this is coming out through communiques, through high-level engagement on the part of the United States with Taiwan, and then the case that you just mentioned in terms of recalling of these individuals at the official level. My own take on this is that I don't know that the United States has fully relinquished its one China policy and recognition of this fact. But at the same time, I think that the Trump administration, like on many number of issues, is kind of testing boundaries. And as he tests those boundaries, I think this is where we get into this action and response scenario that I mentioned earlier. It's looking to see how all the parties respond. So I think at the end of the day, it's going to be more about how Beijing responds than necessarily some of these actions.
And what do you think of this move by Washington to test the boundaries, to push the envelope, and see whether China would respond strongly to the alleged provocations of an unpredictable President Donald Trump?
Yeah, I think in the South China Sea, we can also see this action-reaction cycle. I think since Trump came to power, the U.S. has increased the frequency of the freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea. I myself made a statistics study. In the Obama administration, from the year 2015 to the end of 2016, the U.S. conducted 5 FNOPs in South China Sea. But since Trump came to power from May 2017 up to the September 2018, the U.S. has conducted 8 FNOPs in South China Sea. So the frequency is increasing, and it becomes a regularized operation. So I think, and also the provocation of these FNOPs is increasing. For example, in the past, the U.S., in the Obama administration, when the U.S. conducts FNOPs, it usually will test the innocent passage. It will try to challenge this concept that China will require prior notification when you enter in the territorial sea of island or reef. But in the Trump administration, they are now do not conducting innocent passage. The U.S. warships sometimes will they will do like they are in the open seas, such as the FNOPs around the Mischief Reef. For example, they are going in a zigzag pattern, and they are doing man over the board exercise. So I think the provocation is also increasing. So I think that in the South China Sea, the U.S. is also trying more to test the boundary of China's reactions.
I wanted to get your reactions. How do you see U.S. FNOPs as provocation? Because international law allows to freely navigate into international waters. And since the territory we're talking about is a disputed territory between you and other members of the ASEAN country, so as long as it's disputed, it's not your territory. And it's, if U.S. ships are navigating through international water, how is it provocative?
Yeah, this involves the different interpretation of the UNCLOS provisions, and also the different interpretations of the tribunal reward on July 12, 2016. Because, for example, the Mischief Reef, if the U.S. sails through the 12 nautical miles of Mischief Reef like open sea, it means that the U.S. does not recognize the Mischief Reef as a reef. It means that it thinks that Mischief Reef is a low tide elevation. Well, China still doesn't claim what this feature is in the nature, but the U.S. through its action, has already supported the ruling of the tribunal. So I think this is a
this is controversial from the international perspective. Dr. Wang, what do you say?
Yeah, I want to just add to Colonel Liu's excellent response to Raji's very good question. I actually, I want to argue, first FNA's operations are not just pure military operations, particularly when the United States Navy conducting that. It has very clear political and strategic meanings behind that. So this is something as a scholar I think we should be very clear about. It's not just, some crew members, Navy sailors, somehow planned out of nowhere decided to take that. No, there's a clear strategic political calculation, and also, sending message, signal, political signal, even carry it with the strategic sort of intentions sort of coined in those moves. So I think this is, something we should be, there should be no doubt about that. And secondly, I think why why we believe this is provocative, the provocativeness really comes from the fact that United States is not part of these disputes. Right? So by doing that, legally speaking, you're sort of inserting yourself into these disputes. So, and this is contradictory to the position that the United States has been taking. Oh, we are not inserting ourselves into these disputes. We do not take a position. But then, in actuality, by conducting those proactive, because with the increasing intensity of frequencies, and those operations actually becomes also increasingly more provocative. So I think this is the very important point to acknowledge that it is, first of all, not just a technical operation.
Let me go back to Filippo. With the end of the Cold War, the functions and the role of the NATO became a topical matter for the debates and policy debates. What surprises some of the Chinese observers is the decisions by politicians in Europe that you also assist and be part of the maritime patrols in the South China Sea. I mean, that's an apparent and remarkable extension of a NATO role which was supposed to be moribund with the end of the Cold War. How do you clarify the commitments of NATO member states in the South China Sea?
Staying with the U.S., especially when the U.S. are criticizing NATO for many reasons, saying some reason they are putting at risk security in Europe is probably a reason for doing that. So helping the U.S. in the sense. And then freedom of navigation is very relevant issue. We know that that area, South China Sea, is so important for world trade that we want to have our own voice there.
On many occasions, Dr. Wang and I were discussing the issue of a reglobalization, which means essentially following the inking of an agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico to basically isolate China, which they said is not, particularly Americans have said loud and clear, is not a market economic status. And therefore, those who deal with this non-market status like China in the understatement should inform the other side 6 months ahead. Dr. Wang, do you think what President Trump does is set up yet another multilateral framework to replace the WTO, not only just the NAFTA and even the climate change pact that we reached in Paris?
I think what the Trump administration is doing currently is actually falls into the definition that I gave to reglobalization. It's about restructuring and remodeling of the globalization process and sort of giving...
Which aims to isolate China, basically?
Well, that's some people making that argument. But I would say isolating, quote, isolating perhaps a too strong a word. I think at least part of that, used as tactics or strategy to putting more pressure on China, because what the Trump administration sees that is that they are now entering this sort of tug of war, this trade disputes. And in fact, it's very interesting. Mr. Trump himself actually disputes this concept of trade war. He said, no, this is about disputes. So what I think United States is doing is apparently by engaging, sort of you can call it a creative destruction. So dismantling the old multilateral free trade system, and then try to restructure it according to its own preferences. And in the process of doing that, and then putting more pressure, and in a sense also forming this quote-unquote united front, and try to gain more advantage in its bargaining negotiations with China.
Philip, what do you think of the role that the EU plays in reshaping a world order that's said to be very fragile at this moment?
I think it's a really important role for many reasons. One is to understand how American allies will behave, so we are supposed to be the closest allies to the US, and how China can be attractive for many other countries. That's the point. Because we cannot only deal with these single issues. And security is important in Europe, and for many other reasons it's not that much important, because we are used to live in a peaceful area, because we are lucky, and maybe because the US helped us a lot in the last few years. So what's important to us, and what is can the journalist, the newspaper, to write their article, is economy. And China still seen not only as a cooperation partner, but also as maybe a competitor for many other reasons. So if China really wants to test how Europe can move away or change its behavior, its mind from US toward China, maybe not to become a stricter ally of China, they have to deal on the economic side. And I mean, what is important for European companies is investment rules. So they need that China will allow, will help, will find a way to make our companies happy to go to China, to be in China, and on the other side, when they come to Europe, they have to make investment. They are well welcomed, well received from local business community. That means job creation, and not only what can be perceived from many other people, like just come, buy technology, and go back. This is a very relevant point. There will be a turning point for European behavior toward US and China.
I think that in the past few years, the EU is bothered by various issues such as terrorism, refugee issue, and BRICS. So in the past few years, the EU seems to be looking inward. But in the near term, I think recently the EU has recovered some of its confidence. And I think another change is that the EU, I think, because of the change of the international situation and also the change of the US policy, so the EU tries to be more independent, I think, in the policy making. For example, the UK and France, I think they are now paying more and more to the Asia-Pacific region. For example, the British, in recent 2 years, they send warships to the Asia-Pacific region and held military exercises with Japan and some other countries.
Thank you very much. That's our discussion here on the center stage. I believe many of those in the audience also prepared good questions, and some of them are senior experts about international studies.
I'd like to ask a question about the rules-based international system. We've heard Western powers banging the drum about adherence to a rules-based system. I think this has become an irritant to China, certainly in recent months. I'm wondering if Professor Wang Dong and maybe Colonel Lu Lin could share their thoughts about what China's vision for adherence to a rules-based system entails.
Thank you, Alex, for this question. First of all, I think rule-based international order or system is something everyone should be working very hard together to adhere to. And it's very important. I think it's not a rule-based international order or system is not the property right of the West, including the United States. So one thing, we have this discussion actually over the years many times. One thing, that I'm very actually dissatisfied about, or I think is this American Western narrative, as if pretending that the United States or the West is always on, they are on the siege of like a panel of judge. And looking at it, some other emerging developing countries, including China's behavior, whether you behave well or not, and then I issue a judgment. That is a very arrogant attitude, because we already have this discussion. Everyone knows that United States perhaps has violated international treaties, obligations, walk out of treaties, than all other countries, but still they have this very strong sense of self-righteousness, which I think is very harmful.
I think that the current international system is mainly established by the U.S. and the Western countries. So the rules are set by the U.S. and the Western powers. When China is integrated into the international society, it of course should first adhere to these rules. But I think when these rules were set, the situation and the conditions is quite different from today. At that time you don't see so many emerging countries. They are now rising to the international stage. So I think it's quite natural that they want to have more say on some important issues, especially because the interdependence of the different countries. So they are also trying to provide their ideas and the solutions to these problems. So I don't think that China wants to totally replace the existing international system, but China do think that there are space for improvement of at least some of the rules.
I'm a PhD candidate from the Academy of Military Science. So I think that the problem is about whether it's a new Cold War or not. My question is, what is the definition of a new Cold War? Thank you.
Definition. We go back to the beginning of our discussion.
I think that if you, in the traditional sense, if you say a Cold War, it means that the confrontation between two major blocs with different ideology and with isolated economic systems, just as the U.S. and the former Soviet Union. But I think that in the previous session, almost all the participants agree that we are not in a new Cold War. I think this is because we are not meeting the requirements of the definition of the Cold War. Although there are some competition and the differences among China and the United States, I think that we do not see the, for example, the U.S., it has its alliance system. But China, we do not have a bloc because we do not have the policy of establishing alliances. And the U.S. and China, we are also quite interdependent in economy. And what's more important is that now China and the U.S. is competing in the same economic system. So it's quite different from the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So I think that, of course, why we are talking about the new Cold War, it's because that we are now seeing maybe some elements is rising, is appearing. But if we are doing well in controlling these differences and doing some management of the competition, I think we still do not heading to the Cold War.
Dr. Wang.
Yes, I think before other panelists can jump in, I just want to add to Colonel Liu's remarks. Coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, I actually just had a graduate seminar class yesterday afternoon. We are discussing on the origins of the Cold War. So, and this is also a subject matter I've been studying over the years. I think the several very important, prominent defining features of the Cold War is number one, of course, there's a competing security camps, and also the economic sort of isolated sort of two competing blocs as well. And also, above all, very important is the ideological component of that. I think that's why when we look at the current situation, I think I'm concerned about is that when we look at the current American narrative, including the National Security Strategy document, Vice President Pence's speech, etc., there's a very strong sort of ideological component of that. And we do have this a smell of the Cold War, or even some people say the flavor of McCarthyism actually now is spreading in the United States. So these are things very much should be of concern. But I think it is also another very important intermediate mechanism when we study this, the history or origins of the Cold War is the worsening of security dilemma, or the spiral of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. And what is we have now is also over the years, the past years, the increasingly worsening security dilemma between China and the United States. So I think now it's critically important for us to really to study what really the real mechanism, dynamics of the forces that are driving security dilemma, and how we should be able to address that.
I think in terms of, if I were to characterize one aspect of the current situation that distinguishes it from the Cold War, because we've had obviously excellent definitions of it, I think that the level of uncertainty, and people talk about uncertainty a great deal and how fractured just security threats have become. I think during the Cold War, certainly, those security threats were a lot more straightforward. There was a definite competition between two major powers, and of course these blocs that were created. I don't think that formation is as clear now. And I think that one thing within the Cold War that you don't see now, and that actually we're moving away from, is at least during the Cold War you could have a track one level talk in terms of arms control, these treaties that came out. And what concerns me is you aren't even having those talks anymore. You have the INF treaty withdrawal that the United States may be planning, among other things, and that is a worrisome trend. And I think it really points to the fact that it's not about two players. It's about trilateral constructs. It's about multilateral constructs. So at the end of the day, it's still about those networks that I mentioned earlier.
Cold War can be described as full-time confrontation without any proper war between two major powers. So are we going to experience a full-time confrontation? I think so. The point is, what's going to be at stake? Any security, any position, any influence over countries? I don't know. 2 points might be global footprint related to economic issues and technological leadership. These are two major issues. We are going to experience a different kind of Cold War, and these are 2 main points.
Our Indian friend has basically answered this question at the beginning. So, ladies and gentlemen, throughout this 1-hour discussion about whether we're going to have a new Cold War, my sense is that 5 panelists from the United States, India, Italy, and China reached an agreement, if not consensus, that we're not going to have a bloody new Cold War. Instead, the close economic interdependence will help avert what is being called perhaps self-fulfilling prophecy. Will China be regarded as a friend or enemy, or frenemy? We keep the question open, and the conclusion yet to be settled for our next meeting here, the same time in Xiangshan Forum next year. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.